Hi everyone, I'm Sophie,
And I'm Lainey.
and we did our project on the consequences of prioritizing GDP. Does economic growth define progress and success? GDP, or gross domestic product, measures the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country during 1 year and is the leading indicator of success in most of the world. However, GDP fails to account for the other environmental, economic, and social factors which contribute to a country's well-being. In the maps below, we will compare GDP values with CO2 emissions, income inequality, and national happiness. On this map, you can see the darker colors are countries with higher GDPs. Here is CO2 emissions per country. Carbon dioxide emissions are a key indicator in the environmental impact a country has on the world. And you can see that the core countries such as China and the United States have the most CO2 emissions than any other country, which is captured again in the darker hues. However, even these high numbers can't capture the true impact these countries have, as this map doesn't account for emissions produced by overseas manufacturers to import their products um, overseas. And so as GDP increases, CO2 emissions increase as well. And while correlation does not necessarily equal causation, this map does indicate a very compelling pattern between GDP and high CO2 emissions. It showcases how emphasizing high GDP as a central goal can have negative effects and how continued economic growth over time is not sustainable. So when you drag this over the map, you can see that the patterns are almost uh, exactly the same. There's a little bit of difference, but there's a pretty big pattern there. And here is the same concept. This map shows the pattern of high GDP and high CO2 emissions even more by overlaying CO2 emissions as circles, the largest indicating the highest number of emissions, which the circles are over the countries with the highest GDPs as well.
All right. So income inequality. This is a map of income inequality, and basically it's representing the GINI coefficient, which represents the income or wealth distribution of a nation's residents, and it's the most commonly used measurement of inequality. This map shows a negative correlation between GDP and GINI, where countries with greater income inequality have a lower GDP but a higher GINI, and vice versa. This shows a greater wealth divide in these countries due to more income inequality. However, similar to the CO2 emissions map, this map does not account for the exploitation of these poorer peripheral countries by the larger core countries. If this was accounted for, these core countries would most likely have a higher GINI rating than they actually do. In addition, countries with a higher GDP are still relatively unequal in wealth distribution, and this shows how a country can be depicted as well off with economic growth, but income inequality still inherently persists. So again, the ones with the darker colors have a higher GINI. And then next we have the Happy Planet Index, and it basically measures the happiness and overall well-being of individuals in each country. It accounts for life expectancy, well-being, ecological footprint, and inequality of outcomes. As described by the Happy Planet's Index website, the wealthy Western countries, often seen as the standard of success, do not rate highly on the Happy Planet Index. Instead, several countries in Latin America and Asia Pacific region lead the way by achieving high life expectancy and well-being with much smaller ecological footprints. So like the best example of this is like our own country in the United States. Even though it falls first place for GDP, it fails to even make it in the orange range of the Happy Planet Index, falling into place 108 out of 140. So in this map, the darker reds are the worst GDP. They fall into uh, higher positions in the GDP chart, but it's actually just more money, but also the lower in the Happy Planet Index. So in fact, only a place, the U.S. is actually only a couple of places ahead of Syria, which has a lot of political turmoil and terrorist attacks, which it's gone through, which is just kind of interesting the parallel between that. And so for the richest country in the world to fall so low on the Happy Planet Index, you have to really ask the question if GDP truly captures the country's success. And we can also evaluate GDP and happiness by looking at other places that rank higher on the Happy Planet Index. So, for example, Costa Rica is #1, and we attribute this to the fact that it abolished its military in 1949, and by doing that, been able to real real lot I don't know its wealth to invest in education, health, and pensions. It's also the world leader in environmental protection, and um, it also allocates its taxes directly from the use of fossil fuels back into the protection of forests. So yeah, they've kind of used a lot of their infrastructure, taking away from the military and actually using it to become more environmentally friendly. And they've actually ranked #1 on the Happiness Planet Index, which is pretty interesting since other countries like the U.S. who have #1 in GDP rank really low on the spectrum. So in conclusion, GDP, while it's a decent indicator of direct monetary wealth, it cannot fully capture the other environmental, economic, and social factors that make up the well being of a country. As shown in these maps, success should not be completely defined by wealth, and instead should focus more on overall satisfaction of life to get a more accurate understanding of the state of progress and well being in each country. So we're trying to argue that GDP and economic growth are not a legitimate indicator of a country's overall success, that things like public health, equality, and minimized ecological footprint should instead be the active goals of countries. So thank you. Hope you enjoyed and have a
Thank
good
you,
day.
everyone.
Woo.